Welcome everybody to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode is one that will allow you to come back for more episodes to view or listen to. And if you're a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, as always, I welcome you back and I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So before we get to our main event, always got to give a couple of announcements. First and foremost, if you are on YouTube, please make sure you hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes. And if you're listening from Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please make sure you subscribe there as well. Also, we're switching things up with our donation system. So we are now on Patreon. So if you would like to be a part of the Identity Talk community, you could join Patreon today. It'll be under my name, Sarfo-Mensah. Over there, you'll be able to get exclusive content that only you will be able to see and not the rest of the public. So if you're interested in learning more about the podcast behind the scenes and getting to know me a bit more intimately as far as my day-to-day life and everything else, Patreon will be the place to go. Make sure you become a patron today. And to catch past or new episodes of the podcast, you can go to our main website at identitytalk4educators.com. And then, as I've mentioned the past few episodes, I got a new book coming out called Learning to Relearn, Supporting Identity in the Culturally Affirming Classroom. Pre-order information should be out at this point on Amazon, so make sure you all go ahead and get a copy. And shout out to Janessa Burks, who illustrated this beautiful cover. She will be on a future episode of the podcast to talk more about that in her life. So I look forward to having her on so you all can learn more about her brilliance. But yeah, the book is going to be coming out in November through Stenhouse and Routledge. And I am excited to finally share this with the world. So please get your pre-ordered copy today so we can talk about this book together, so we can have these important conversations surrounding identity with our students. Thank you. All right, y'all. So we are now at the main event, and today's guest is someone who is a part of the ALOC community, someone who I've gotten a chance to learn more about over the past few months through his work. Had a chance to meet him finally in person at his school in Vietnam. And yeah, he's somebody who has a very rich story that I believe will captivate the audience today, you all. And I'm excited to finally have him on the podcast. So let's get to it. Without further ado, let's bring on Mr. Juan Jacobs Sheblak to the podcast to talk about his story, his family, his life, and everything in between. So let's get Juan on and we'll get started. Yes, sir. Good morning.
Hey, Kwame, how are you?
Not bad. How you feeling?
Good. Thank you for inviting me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate you for accepting the invitation. I know that the school year is winding down. So what's the summer looking like for you, sir?
So the summer is college prep, which is really important. That's a huge achievement for the family and getting our Lindy ready for college, and then getting Tandy to enter a US school. So she'll be going to a US school. So that's more of the summer, and just asking us enjoying that family life. You know, college changes the family dynamics, and so just kind of like living in that last vestige of just being a family and the dynamics still being very much similar to being in school.
Yes, and first off, congratulations on the achievement. I know as a father, that's a milestone that you don't take for granted. Seeing your kids grow up before your eyes and to see them take this next step in their lives towards adulthood, that's a monumentous achievement.
It is indeed, and it's interesting because you have that tension between, especially with my daughter, that she's ready for it, and at the same time for her, the realization of, oh, I'm actually going to do it now. You know, there's a difference between being ready for it and suddenly going, oh, I'm actually doing it. And so there's a celebration, and there's still that guidance. There's still that. I always kind of like say we're not engineers of our children. So we can't engineer them what we want them to be, but we can shepherd them in understanding their values and living their values. And so we become shepherds of who they are. And so, so we look at that and we see that transformation in the family, and we're excited.
Yeah, and there's so much more to that journey. Well, I'm just excited to have you on, and let's go ahead and get started and start from the beginning. You might be the first South African I've had on my podcast in 160 plus episodes. So congratulations to you. You're making history today. So growing up in South Africa, and of course, I'm assuming during the apartheid era, just to give context for folks, I'd love for you to just share a little bit about what that was like from a first person perspective growing up during that time that we've learned about, most of us through history and through books and other types of media, but as someone that was there, what was that like for you?
So it's really interesting. For me, the biggest part is the mid 80s when I started high school. That was really that major awareness, right? And so the political situation during that time was that, especially in Black African communities, they were really kind of like where limitations of movement, communication, political expression, everything else was focused on that. And so they had very little avenues to be able to express that. And it's interesting during that time, when you look at mixed race communities, they then became the voice of that oppression in terms of that. So, for me, part of my upbringing, for example, was protesting, right? And so during apartheid, we lived in segregated areas. I lived in a mixed race community, and the Black and the Indian and white communities were all segregated. And so the interesting part is that we were on one hill, literally, Kwame. On one hill was our school, had a massive valley with a road at the bottom. On the other side was a white community and a white school. And we would watch them on break. We could see them and just their facilities and where the school. It was really interesting how different it was in terms of that. And so during apartheid, it was illegal for you not to be in school, right? So it was that forced education part. And one of the big reasons was that you couldn't protest then. Because if you protested, you were out of class, and so we could arrest you. So that was my experience, and having parents who were solely focused on education and not necessarily the political situation, which is interesting because when you look at that generation, my generation during that time, being 14, 15, 16, and fundamentally believing we could dismantle a government. There's some part of when your frontal cortex is not totally developed, you can believe something like that.
It's called irrational confidence, huh?
Like, and that's it was one of those things where you sat and protest as a 14-year-old, believing, sitting there on a field, on a rugby field, singing band song, singing about a man that has been put in jail and you've never seen, because we've never seen Nelson Mandela by then. Pictures were banned, right? All the pictures, Walter Sisulu, all the major players, the Robben Island, they were all banned, the pictures, images. But we believed in these people. We fundamentally believed in them, what they stood for, why they were in jail, and protesting. All that was part of my upbringing in terms of that. And then also having that understanding that education is the way out. So that was an interesting part, right? So you're protesting, but you're also realizing that education is the way you're going to uplift yourself and the way you're going to move forward, and then striking that balance. And so come around 1993, we end up going first people to go to a desegregated university. That was interesting because didn't know how to use computers, because we never needed to use computers. No one told you on styles of taking notes or being able to type an essay of 500 words, all these kind of things. So during our university years, we played a lot of catch-up. to our counterparts in terms of, for lack of better part, white people, because the education system was designed differently to ours. So we played catch up. We played a lot of catch up, but at the same time, we also found our voice. We also found our identity during that time at college. Fast forwarding, I then became a monk for 4 years, a contemplative monk for 4 years. And then after that, many of us and many of my friends and peers, we entered into the transition government of South Africa, and we really worked within government in terms of transforming government for everybody in South Africa. So that's my path. And then I met Ed, and he had Lindy already, because he adopted Lindy by then. And then I got introduced to the international school, especially in Johannesburg. And so I entered into that space. And at that time, service learning was very much it's a danger to go into townships. And so when I arrived there, it was interesting because we transformed that thinking that it's not dangerous. I started to transform the service learning program, and we were going into the township, and we were partnering with different NGOs within the township in terms of that. So by the time I left Johannesburg, there were about 24 service projects ongoing, all student-led and all partnership. And so there was that aspect of international schools have privilege, don't hide it, don't be shy about it, but how do we use privilege to improve the world around us? And it's not that saviorism complex, it's about partnering and creating sustainable partnerships. So that was like in 2011, 2012, that's what we were talking about already in South Africa with our service learning projects in Johannesburg. Is that sustainable partnership? How does it work? Realizing that we are not a social development agency, we are a school, but we certainly can use our finances, our infrastructure, and our influence to be able to assist these social development projects within surrounding Johannesburg, and for example in Diepsloot, right? So Diepsloot was a township, and then I don't know the stats now, but then it was estimated that 80% of people who came into South Africa from outside of South Africa would first settle in Diepsloot before they moved off. Mm-hmm. Right? So that was interesting to when you go to a community and there is, for lack of a better word, the whole of Africa is just mixed. And at the same time, it's a very transient community because you come, you stay for a few months, then you leave. So we got to engage in that vibrancy, because that's the vibrancy. That's where, for me, education became a really powerful tool of transformation and of activism, because that is why for me as an educator, I think activism has got a bad rap, and I think activism should be seen as social transformation and economic, and it's a transformative part of education. And so that's where that partnership comes in terms of how we do it. And so that was number one for me, because I experienced that coming from a school that had limited resources and then having to study so hard to get into university, right? And having the odds stacked against you to get funding to be able to go to university. Then you end up there, right? And so you're doing all this. And so the thing for me is service, it's transformation, it's activism. That's where education lies. And how do we make a world a better place? And I always refer to myself as that 14-year-old in terms of we can change the world. My life is centered on we can change the world. We can change the world. And we are busy and we're going to change the world in terms of a better place. So we never lose sight of that. No matter for me, no matter what it is, we never lose sight of that hope.
I think that hope is very important. And it's clear that you're somebody that embodied that hope in everything that you did. I want to rewind a little bit because before you became an educator, now you had a previous career. You're doing a lot of work with mass media communications.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about what you mentioned before about how you were always like this vocal person. You were speaking out, you were protesting. I'm wondering if that had an influence in you delving into mass media communications before you ultimately became the educator you are now.
So there's a part of me that was a radio journalist, And then I was an audio and visual mixer, a radio engineer I started off as. And I was on site somewhere. The journalist didn't arrive. One of the producers called me. I had to do, I'm like on my cell phone, I'm doing a quick kind of like radio broadcast about where I am. And he goes afterwards, and he's a seasoned veteran, and he said to me, "Hey, you are really good at doing this. Do you want to become a radio journalist?" And I went like, okay. And so I delved into that, right? And part of what I did as sound engineer is that I would create radio stories. And so when it came to like June 16th, or it came to Sharpstown and all these things, I would create visual sounds, for lack of a better word, and programs around that. And so that is where I really delved into understanding how media impacts what we see, how we experience sound. One of my first programs I ever did was a radio documentary for, I think it was a 20-minute radio documentary on one of the protests in South Africa. And I took sound bites and we put it all together. And it was just like so fascinating to bring that alive to people in terms of radio. And then the journalistic work in terms of interviewing person, finding out information behind the information, trying to figure out what the thinking is behind a lot of political thinking of that time, right? So having those conversations, for me, that was where that aspect came in of looking at journalism, looking at radio in terms of that transformation tool. Because you were interviewing, and I was trained by people, South Africans who were trained by the BBC, for example. And so it was those skills in terms of that. And so for me to ask questions and to understand and to listen, it's somewhat natural, right? And I apply it to schools also, like when you're in a meeting. It's some same, use that same skills in terms of trying to unpack what's actually happening. You're a journalist, essentially, trying to make sense of the world around you, right? And then when I joined the South African government, I was part of their communications team. And so that was also in terms of understanding what we were doing on a national level, what we were doing and how to communicate that, all our programs. So those kind of aspects of how we interpret news and what we learn, what we unpack from news, that for me was really important, right? And that transformation. I'm going to go back, and so that's the thing that you can see throughout, is that transformation aspect, how being about transformation through everything that we do, and communication was one of those big things.
Which is interesting to me, because I can remember a conversation that you were having with somebody, and I overheard you saying, it's taken me a minute to discover my voice as a BIPOC leader in an international school. But then you're sitting here telling me about how it's natural for you to project and amplify different issues and speak on these issues so eloquently. So just to help our audience, I'd love for you to just talk to me about the process that you've gone through as far as discovering your voice as a leader in international school.
I think that's a really interesting journey, because when I look at my professional life, for lack of a better word, in South Africa, right? When we look at how I grew up, that amplification, that walking into the workplace and being transformative, and being a person of color, which is the dominant group. So you must remember that. So we're working into government, we are the dominant group there, right? We're creating transformation. International school flipped the script, and that was very different for me. So I walked into an environment that was predominantly white and didn't necessarily cater for people of color, and especially people of color who had opinions and experience, right? And the aspect of, if you want leadership, and I've been told that, if you want leadership, don't rock the boat, don't ask too many questions, don't raise any issues. That was my messaging I got for being a leader in international school. And so there's a journey of me in terms of, no, I'm not placating to your rules on your field. I'll create my own field. And the rules that apply to me, we will change the game in terms of that. And so that was really important for me to find my voice, because you also have to remember that when you walk into a school where the only person closest to you is the person that is support staff and cleans classroom. And this is in South Africa. You can imagine that there's no one else to really talk to about your experience. And everybody else is kind of like, just be calm, don't overreact, don't be too loud, don't be too aggressive, don't raise any issues. Those were the kind of messaging I got in terms of that.
Wow.
And
Wow.
you do take a step back in terms of going, okay, am I in the wrong? Like, what's wrong with me? Because there's no one that you can look at. But then again, I looked outside of, and this is really important, I looked outside of the school, right? So I looked at Ahmed Kathrada, who was with Nelson Mandela, who was arrested. Him and I kind of knew each other. We sat next to each other. We spoke. I met Nelson Mandela at one stage. I met Bishop Tutu at one stage. You know, I met different people at different phases of my life. And there was that question of, why am I questioning who I am when I look at the people I compare my life to? The people I compare my life to is not the other director of the school. The people I compare my life to is not the principal or the teacher. The people I compare my life to is the people I sat around the table. Nelson Mandela, Ahmed Kathrada, Bishop Tutu. Those are the people. And when I say I stand on the shoulders of giants, those are the giants I stand on the shoulders of. And that for me is really something that is really important, that motivates, right? And sometimes that motivation and that foundation can be lonely at times, because the people that you often engage with don't understand what it means to meet people like that.
Now I'm going to be nosy for a little bit. Feel free to divulge what you want to divulge. So before you moved to Asia, you were in your home country for a very long time.
Yep.
You're in your home country. You're in one of the premier international schools within your home country. I'm sure you've seen a lot of people who are not from your home country, and they're responsible for making decisions that are impacting folks who are from where you're from. So I'm thinking to myself, how's it that someone of your experience, of your skills and expertise and background and brilliance, you're in this setting, and yet you're not able to have the voice that you would hope to have in that setting, given the fact that you are a citizen of the very country where this school is surrounded? I'm just curious to know what ultimately pushed you to want to leave your home country and then finally find a leadership position outside of that. I think that's important for people to know.
It's a crazy kind of like story in terms of that. We had meetings at the school. It was interesting because at that time, there were more mixed race students at the school than there were white kids. So you can imagine that this is mixed race, right? So all across the board, I looked at my daughter's class and they were predominantly mixed race. And I never forget my husband saying to the director at that stage, why is it that for my daughters to find someone to look like them, it needs to be the people who clean? That's what he said. And it struck us. We've always had this conversation. That was the reflection of our kids. So that was one part. The second part was, there's always, and there currently is, this it's actually been an undertone anymore. I don't think it's an undertone. It's just overt in terms of that when you're from the host country, you're not good enough. Now, you can imagine, I went to South African University. I did my master's in sustainable development and renewable energies at Stellenbosch, which is one of the premier universities in the world with that context. No, was not good enough. Wow. I then went to College of New Jersey. I did a certification and a master's program, but I couldn't teach a subject matter. I remember one of the things that I reflected on was they brought someone who had an undergraduate degree to teach a subject economics, that I was well versed in. But it's because I was like, as a South African, how could you? But there were white South Africans full-time teachers. There weren't teachers of color as full-time teachers at that school. So I remember reflecting on the fact that do I sound white enough, and that's why you want to be here? Do I represent something that is nuanced to you, so you're okay with me, right? Because of the way I speak and my accent and everything else. So those were things that I really questioned about my identity being at that school, because no one else was there like me. So that was a genuine struggle in terms of that. And then when you do look at leadership opportunities, it was like you had to work 20 times harder than your counterpart.
Always.
Right? And legitimately so in South African context, we wanted our girls to have a foundation in their culture and where they're coming from. And so we stayed a bit longer. But after a while, it was a sense of, why am I struggling in this place that will not recognize me and will never recognize who I am as a person, what I can do. And so it was you can imagine, I mean, you spent your life being part of a country and helping to rebuild a country and having to step away and go, yeah, I need to step away from the school and leave. That was really a hard decision. And the economics behind it also. As a host country hire, you got paid a lot less. And I remember saying, why are we struggling? So there was that professional fulfillment and always being looked over, and always my application was always seen different, right, to other people's application. And international is always better. And so I'm unapologetic about the question of 3 questions I have is international schools in Africa and in what are their foundations rooted in is something that they need to reflect on. They need to reflect on that. I think that there's that aspect of it. What is the identity of the school rooted in? Why were they established? The second part is to look at predominantly why is white seen as better in leadership in African schools, international schools. It's something that I reflect upon and I think about all the time. What are you telling the students? The students who are generally multicultural, because a lot of international schools in Africa are not predominantly white anymore. It's multicultural. Yet there still seems to be a pull towards having white men as leaders, and that's it. And so how are those students reflect?
Wow.
I'm being honest in terms of that. Another part is I was writing a reflection on the conference that's going to be held in Cape Town that's called Sawubona. And it is something that I find deeply, deeply, and I don't want to use offensive because that doesn't even describe. You're talking about Sawubona, which says your humanity and my humanity has the same value. I see you, you see me. We see each other, our humanity has the same value. Then why is it that people of color are not leaders in African schools, international schools? Because then you're not seeing my humanity at the same value. So those are the things that I think, to be honest with you, Kwame, makes people uncomfortable, and I'm okay with that. I made my peace.
Well, I know you're okay with that. We know that. I know.
and there's an aspect of if the community is not willing to explore those themes, then it's okay. I don't have to be part of that community. I will find that community. I'll do the work in terms of that, and so yeah, and so I'm really working with that in terms of education, and I think it's very challenging for people. And it's not about blaming. It's not about you are wrong. It's got nothing to do with that. It's the question of how do you grow to be a more diverse and agile and flexible community in response to the needs of the current generation. And that's it, because when we say diverse thinking and you only have white men and white women around you in your senior leadership team, where's that diverse thinking, right? When the teachers are predominantly North American, where's your diverse thinking? When you think that DIJ is a North American concept and construct, When you think that, and you like, because it's not, North America doesn't own diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so where's your diverse thinking in terms of that, right? And so we're talking about an agile society, because that's what we are learning to become. We are learning to become, or we need to learn to become, an agile society that responds to an unknown future. But how do you do that when you're dominated by masculine male thinking, Western thinking, right? White Western thinking, and that's your only frame of reference, right?
Facts.
When you have kids in your class that come from 20 different countries, 20 different ways of thinking, 20 different ways of understanding values and relationships, and you have, throughout their career, they have one centric race teaching them, right? And so I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just saying, how do you create an agile society to respond to an unknown future?
So this season, Identity Talk for Educators Live will be including ad spots for businesses, products, and events that are adding significant value to their communities. And here's the catch. You don't have to be an educator or an education-based business to be a part of this. We're looking for people who are just doing great work in the community, and we want to use our platform as a way to amplify their work. So if you are an entrepreneur or you know of an entrepreneur who is doing just that, bring them in our direction. Have them reach out to us. If they want to learn more about their ad spots and how they can get themselves promoted on this platform, they can contact myself, Kwame at identitytalkforeducators.com. I'll say it one more time. It is Kwame at identitytalkforeducators.com. Hope to hear from you, and let's keep on amplifying our work and building each other up. Yeah, I think that's the key. That's the key. And it's a shame that so many African educators of color have to leave their home countries in order for them to get the value and to have their worth recognized in a way that wasn't when they were in their home country.
Yeah, yes. And
it's a shame.
It is, because you go all over Africa and you talk to people and you listen to people, and you find out that they had to leave. And it is such a pity. But then they can't even travel within Africa. They leave the continent, which is even more sad. Like, why do they have to leave the continent to get leadership opportunities rather than? And you want to say that 355 million people, you couldn't find African leaders? I'm confused by the statistics behind all this. And so that's where I'm at, right? That's where I'm at in terms of asking the question. And if I'm going to be that reflective thought, that's what I'm going to be. That's my voice.
So funny you're talking about this, because in the last African Affinity Group meeting that we has had, I know you missed that, but one of the members mentioned this idea that racism is a form of narcissistic abuse. And I had never heard of that phrasing ever. And when you think about it, it pretty much explains the situation regarding international schools, particularly on the African continent. You mentioned the oversaturation of white heads of schools, white male heads of schools more specifically, just the overemphasis on cis heteronormative thinking when it comes to how policies are shaped, when it comes to how we use language, when it comes to how we even shape curriculum. Like, these are things that are prevalent throughout the continent. And when I think about narcissism, I'm also thinking about the total disregard for cultural capital. Which is mind-blowing to me, given the transient nature of our international school ecosystem, where you have people who are not from the host country leaving after a few years, and then you're resetting again.
Yes.
So I would think it would make all the sense in the world to invest in more African school leaders who you know for a fact will be mainstays there and can provide the cultural context that's constantly missing in these international schools.
Well, I mean, you look at the curriculum and the content. You look at history, right?
Yes,
How much indigenous history is taught at international schools?
very
Very,
little to none.
because there are very few resources, local resources to tap into, will be able to articulate that. That's the one part. The other part is, for whom were the schools originally established? Right? For that is something that, and so when a school says, but when we talk about DIJ, or we're talking about bringing leaders of color, we're taking away our identity. And so my question is, if your school is steeped into white supremacy as its history, because that's what is established, why are you scared? Are you scared that whiteness is going to be taken away? And for you to be able to articulate that is scary. When people at schools talk about that, about the boards wanting white people, it's like, don't you tell the board, hey, that's a bit racist, isn't it? If your board is forcing you to have white, because that's what most heads of schools are saying, that they want white people. And so I want to ask boards all over the world if that is true. If they want white people as lead, if they only want white people as leaders of this. If it is, then it should be publicly stated. Right? It should be said.
I
Because
mean, but you know, Juan, yeah, publicly stated, yes, I could agree with you on that. But we know that default is that.
yeah,
It doesn't even need to be stated. It's very clear in terms of how the design is, in terms of how everything is structured, that it's done in a way to maintain and uphold whiteness.
yeah. I mean, I go through my process of interviews, and you do know when it's said around a candidate who is white, they are able to grow, or there's areas of growth. We see that as professional development. They will grow into the position. They will assume. When you say that about a person of color, it refers to their competency. And that they're not incompetent. So my areas of growth highlights my incompetencies in interview. But for a person who's non-white, growth areas is not seen as a competency, as they can learn. So there's this. It's a.
But you know what's funny? Let me help you with that too. And if you are a person of color candidate who does not vocalize those areas of growth, now you're viewed as being arrogant. Now you're viewed as being cocky.
Yeah.
And that goes against you as well. So it's a no-win situation.
Yeah, it is. It's one of those instances where that happens in terms of that. And yet, when you look at a lot of leaders of color, the students and the parents are always their biggest support. I have to admit that in most instances, the schools that are at, parents and students were the biggest supporters in terms of where I've gone and where I've been. And aspects of some head of schools have been supportive. I mean, I've been to a school where I got told, you're not going to go on any of the brochures. You're not going to go on any of the publications because you're brown-skinned and you don't advertise well for our clientele. So those are the things we kind of like look at and you ponder and you, it's you know what, being a leader of color is a struggle. It's always a struggle, but there's an aspect of love within that struggle. There's an aspect of hope within that struggle. You know, I look at it and I go, like, the struggle can be hard, and sometimes in that moment in time, it's so hard. It can frustrate you and angers you, right? And at the same time, when you look back on it, you understand the love that you have for what you are doing, the love that you believe in what you are doing. And so you have to find that love of what you do within the struggle, because unfortunately, it's a constant place of struggle.
It is. And it's something that's going to continue to weigh you down if you don't find the joy within that.
Yeah.
So this is actually perfect because it leads me to my next question. Thinking about your own identity, being a queer man, being an educator, knowing your history living in apartheid South Africa, growing up there, and then also considering the fact that you have Malaysian, you have Dutch, you have Indian heritage in you as well. How has going through the process of unpacking your own identity allow you to increase your awareness as far as understanding the intersections of your students' identities and other people?
There's an aspect of me of growing up realizing, because also like post-apartheid, the whole concept of one's identity within the new South Africa, post-1994, you're not white enough to be white, but you're not black enough to be black. So those are things that you really try to unpack in terms of your identity and who you are. And then being a queer person. And I mean, I'm fortunate that really post 1994, and then you look at the Constitution and the inclusion of South Africa in our Constitution in terms of everybody is free, and this is related to everybody. I mean, I know that if Nelson Mandela probably had a referendum on that, South Africa would have been, or probably have said no to gay rights, right? And he made that difficult choice of not putting it up for referendum and saying that if we say everybody is free and everybody's protected, we should mean everybody. So we have that aspect. You also have the understanding of, for me, going against the grain in terms of who I am as a person. All those struggles really help you to understand when students are going through what they are going through. You know, it's kind of like that triple threat, being a person of color and being queer and being a leader. I celebrate those struggles in terms of that, because that helps me understand the struggles of the students in terms of their identity and where they come from. And it also helps students to be able to identify with someone who looks different to them, but also create that huge sense of empathy. I cannot emphasize so more that empathy of my personal journey. Now, middle schoolers, if you're not true to yourself, man, they see through that. That's one thing about middle schoolers I appreciate. They see through your uncomfortableness. You know, and so you really have to know yourself, and you have to be honest with your journey with yourself. I'm not saying you got to tell everybody. I'm not saying, but you have to understand your struggle, because if you don't understand your struggle, you won't understand, or you'll struggle to understand how to relate to students, and students see through that. Right now, in high school, they'll ignore you. Middle school will tell you straightforward, you look uncomfortable. Right? I don't want to talk to you because you don't look comfortable with yourself. They'll say that. And it's so true. That's apropos in terms of that. And so, you know, and being able to tell students about your struggle. Now, you don't tell them the inner workings of your life story, but to be able to tell age-appropriate stories about your struggle really helps students understand their journey. And that's...
And I think, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But I think that ability to be vulnerable is a tool for connection in this current context we find ourselves in. Students need to know that you do have your shortcomings. They need to know that you don't know everything. They need to know that there is a fear that you're still trying to reconcile within yourself. These are things that help them understand that, hey, he doesn't have it all figured out, but he's willing to build with me. He's willing to go through that journey with me and help me figure it out as he's trying to figure it out.
Well, I mean, it's like one of the articles that I wrote is that student voice is a voice of justice. You're not doing justice to who they are as students if their voices aren't included in your school. And so, because we've kind of like tried to silence the justice part in different aspects, and it's like, what's wrong with a just society? Why have we removed that word justice a lot from our vocabulary when we talk about inclusion and equity? right? And so for me, there's an aspect of justice. When you look at student voice, it's an act of justice. I genuinely believe that, because I look at my school experience in terms of not having a voice and then having to find my voice as an activist, right? And then looking at protest and hearing the different views of protest and trying to reconcile that the fact that you can't protest because it makes me feel uncomfortable. And you kind of go, but that is the object of protesting. Protesting is supposed to make you feel uncomfortable so that you may reflect on the injustices of this world. So when you talk about change and when you talk about changing within society, there's an uncomfortableness. Now, we hear a lot of school leaders talk, be ready to be uncomfortable, be comfortable to be uncomfortable, right? I've heard that many speeches at schools. Be comfortable to be uncomfortable. Okay, but then why does it stop? Why does it stop at equity work and inclusion and diversity? Suddenly, that uncomfortableness we can't deal with, right? And so these are questions that I know comment makes people feel uncomfortable, but I sit back and I listen to these speeches, right? And I believe you. I'm going to believe you because that's what you say. It's like, okay, let's be uncomfortable. But hold on. But now, when I say something that makes you feel uncomfortable, you don't want to talk. But you just said that we need to be ready to be uncomfortable. There's a saying, a man's words will be taken like a bull by the horns, right? And so what you say is who you are. That's my philosophy. What you say is who you are. What you talk about organizationally, what you talk about in speeches, as a school leader or as a leader, what you talk about in terms of your philosophy, that's your word. I'm going to take it as that. I'm going to believe it as that. And so when you talk about equity work, I'm going to believe that your school, if you talk about representation, I'm going to believe that your school is going to do that. Right? And when your school don't do that, I'm going to ask the question, why? Now, if that makes you feel uncomfortable, that's not me. That's just the question. Right? And so we continuously need to look at that and understand that equity work is uncomfortable work. It's the same with, so this is the point. We're talking about including neurodiversity. We're talking about MTSS. We're talking about all these things, pedagogy. We're talking about assessments. We're talking about grading. All these are changes.
Yes.
All these are fundamental shifts in education. All these things are fundamental shifts. Why is racial equity not? Why is that so uncomfortable that we don't do it? But we've done everything else, right? We've done everything else in terms of that fundamental shift. And so my question is, why does it stop at racial equity? Why is it that uncomfortable? So yeah,
that's a good question.
Right? So it's just UDL, MTSS, all those stuff. We PBIS, restorative practices, all these things, fundamental shift in education. But when it comes to equity work and racial work, no, it's too uncomfortable. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's always interesting to think about because all those things you mentioned are intertwined with racial equity.
Yep.
Restorative practices is a way to build racial equity because you are talking about repairing harm, restoring peace. And the reason why there is a lack of peace is because of the racism that's taking place within the institution. So we have to restore the peace by listening to the stories of the students and your faculty and other support staff members who are experiencing it firsthand. But that's a whole nother episode that we have a different
session about that. And it's interesting because even when I sit on the table and we talk about stuff and we talk about host country, faculty, and everything else, and sometimes I would say I used to be a host country faculty member, and that jars people. That jars a lot of people around the table around leadership because people tend to forget that about me. I interview and I will say, I am not a Western person of color. I'm South African, right? I have 7 different cultures by which I navigate. 11 different languages, and but 10 different cultures that I navigate in terms of who I am. So I'm not going to be your dominant linear thinker. I'm not. That's not who I am. Are you ready for that? Yes, Juan, we are. Okay. It's when I get to sit at the table, and they get to experience that non-linear thinking. And it makes people really uncomfortable when they don't have a linear thinking, because they want A, B, C, D, and therefore E will happen. And I will go, not really, because you get 8.1 and 8.2. We can still get there, but you got to look at it from different angles, right? I've been taught to look at things from a wide angle because I come from a place that has 11 different languages, official languages. All have a different nuance in culture and the way they view relationships and the way they view thinking. So it's easy for me to be adaptable in terms of that. And we sit around the table with people who are predominantly linear. They struggle to understand when you have a conversation or when you ask questions. Okay, they really do, right? And from a cultural point of view, when you say, I'm opening up the table for a reflective or critical fan conversation, I'm going to have that conversation. I'm not going to seek approval from the person next to me or behind me, because you invited me to that conversation. So we're going to have that, right? And so it's just interesting when you're navigating those things to understand how that works. And then how it works in the classroom, right? Because we want assessments to be linear. We want these things to be linear when we're dealing with kids from 10 different countries, where time is not necessarily linear.
Yeah, and that's the mistake that we make time and time again. But I want to go ahead and wrap things up with this last question, and it's the one that I ask everybody. How do you, Juan, stay true to the teacher in you?
Number one, I'm always in the classroom. So I'm always, the second part is always talking about to kids about what they're learning. That is fundamental to me. Like, what are they learning? Why they're learning? How are they learning? And then for me, the teacher in me is always reading a book with intentionality and slowly, and making sure that I'm really reflecting continuously at it. Right, so I don't read 40 books in a year and go, I've read 40 books. I might read 5 or 6, but it's really working through those books and saying, how does this apply to me personally? I focus a lot on how do I develop myself, because as you know and I know, we need to work harder at who we are.
We do. Yeah.
We do. And so I've learned that those are fundamental shifts that need to be true to my nature. It's just not, I'm in the book and I've read it and so it's good, right? I read a book, I'm going to really dig deep in who I am and what I am about. So that's how I stay true to the teacher in me. Yeah, that's how the continuous learning, and not lifelong, the continuous learning, because you never stop learning about yourself.
That's so true. Man, Juan, man, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. And before you go, please let people know how they can connect with you on social media and beyond.
So I'm on Twitter and on LinkedIn. So I can send you those details.
Yeah, that'll be on the episode notes. So yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I'll do that in terms of, so, and my email address. I'll add my email address. I'm always open for discussions, Kwame. People need, in terms of they're navigating something, totally happy to share. Just my experience in terms of that.
All right, y'all heard it here. Make sure you get connected to Juan. Have those good conversations. But thank you again. I know your day is coming to an end. We will get together soon, my friend.
I appreciate so much. And to everybody out there, Kwame, you're doing amazing work. Your book, I am overly excited about it. Congratulations. And I know it's a labor of love. Pre-order, yes, definitely. And actually, and for me, to be honest with you, I can't wait for you because I really want to use it. It's that where it's a practical book where you want to use it, because I know the author apparently is really practical in his approach. and thoughtful. And so I'm excited about that in terms of taking that and saying, how do we use this? How do you use what we have?
There's a lot of good ideas in there, so it'll be more than practical, but there's also a section of it where you're going to have to do some capacity building.
Excellent.
So yeah, that's the important part there. Well, Juan, man, thank you. Man, you have a good rest of the day, sir.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. You have a great day.
All right, y'all. So we about to end another episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, people.